This short video is going to address two issues. In the first issue, we're going to talk about how atmospheric perspective is created and how it's utilized to create a sense of depth or space within a composition. The other issue will deal with a subtractive or reductive process used to create a drawing. In this image, you see three rectangles that appear to move back in space as they move from left to right. This illusion is created using only the elements of atmospheric perspective. Artists have several devices available to them to create a sense of space within a composition. The first is scale. Notice that the large objects appear closer to the picture plane, while the smaller objects appear to recede into the distance. The next device is overlapping. When one object overlaps another, it appears to be in front of that second object. And the final device is vertical placement within the composition. Elements that are placed higher in the composition tend to look like they are further away. Aerial or atmospheric perspective refers to the effect the atmosphere has on the appearance of objects as they move back into space. Following these three guidelines will help you create that illusion in your drawings. The first deals with value contrast. As something moves back in space, the value contrast between it and the background decreases, but also any value contrasts that are contained within the object decrease as well. The next is the idea that as things move back in space, the ability to see distinct edges and details is lost. And the last idea deals with color. As things move back in space, the colors become less saturated, and they shift towards neutral or gray. The late summer weather forecast in Indiana always seems to include the three H's: hazy, hot, and humid. As you can see in this recently stolen photograph, that the haze or atmosphere becomes an important part of this image. As you move back in this image, you lose detail, you lose focus, you lose value contrast, and you lose color saturation. And until finally, in the very back of the image, you can't distinguish sky from ground. So quickly to review, the three most important components of atmospheric perspective are loss of value contrasts, loss of color saturation, and loss of detail. Those of you with curious minds can read this slide at your leisure. Over the last 15 or 20 years, the word awesome has become a commonly used adjective. And I think this is unfortunate because the word lost its power. There are very few things that are truly awesome. One of those things is the view of Earth from space. In addition to being awesome, this view of Earth from space is a nice example of how atmospheric perspective functions. Here are a few examples of how atmospheric perspective functions in an artwork. The atmospheric perspective is obvious between the dock and the towers. But take a closer look at the near tower versus the far tower, and you can see how even subtle changes can make a big difference. This image is so powerful, you can almost feel the atmosphere. Notice the bright light diffusing through the atmosphere in the background. Notice how it almost completely obliterates the imagery. All right, let's take a minute and talk about reductive or subtractive drawing. In this technique, the drawing surface is covered with pigment, graphite or charcoal or Conte, and then the image is pulled up through the use of various types of erasers. The amount of pigment applied to the paper is up to the artist. It can be a neutral amount or it could be a dark amount. Couple of tips, however. I would avoid using my fingers to rub the pigment into the page because your fingers frequently contain oil which will act as a binder, making it more difficult to remove pigment later. And I would also be very conscious of the texture of my tabletop or my desktop. Any kind of bumps or lumps or scratches or any of those sorts of things will transfer to your image if you aren't conscious of that. If you have a wide range of erasers, you'll be able to create different effects, pulling pigment off the page. It's important to have an eraser that can create a sharp edge or a sharp line if you want to include detail in your composition. And finally, you can of course add pigment back to your image to create darker areas and sharpen edges. Here are a few examples of artwork that utilize the subtractive or reductive process. Notice how this artist used the eraser like any mark-making tool. Notice how the marks follow the contours of the objects, adding to that sense of dimension. Notice how this artist was able to capture that sense of a directional light source using various subtle changes in tone and value. Before we go any farther with this assignment, let's take a minute and review the chiaroscuro sphere. Most beginning artists understand how the highlight functions and how the midtone area is produced and what causes the cast shadow. But when we start talking about the core of the shadow, in this case labeled deep shadow, and the reflected light area, things get more confusing. The reflected light area is caused by light bouncing off of other surfaces, like the table. The light strikes the table and bounces off the table and illuminates the underside of the sphere. Reflected light has a funny gray quality, and it's really easy to miss this. You will need to make a conscious effort to look for this type of light. Understanding where the core of the shadow is where it is a little more complicated still. As we move around the form from highlight to the shadow core, the angle of the surface changes. As less and less light falls on the sphere, the value darkens until you reach the center of the shadow core. This area receives no light from the primary light source. The same thing happens to the reflected light area. As you move towards the shadow core from the backside, the illumination from the light bouncing off the table is reduced until the center of the shadow core receives no light at all. I hope this presentation helps you make drawings that more convincingly convey the ideas of form in space.